Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. That was a call and response. They say it takes about 4 times call and response to quiet a room. You've done it in 3. You're an exceptional group. Good afternoon. My name is Chet Hewitt, and I have the honor to serve as the chair of PPIC's Board of Directors. I am pleased to welcome you all to today's event. It is the 4th in our 2023 speaker series on California's future. We are delighted to present the program today featuring California State Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon. A Los Angeles native, he was elected to the Assembly in 2012 to represent the 62nd Assembly District in Southeast Los Angeles County and elected Speaker in 2016. Moderating the conversation with Speaker Rendon is PPIC's new President and CEO, Tani Cantil-Sakauye. And as you all know, for the 12 years prior to joining PPIC, Tani served as the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. Thank you to both of you for joining us today. We'd also like to thank the sponsors of our speaker series. Their support makes it possible for these events to be free and available to the public. The sponsors are listed on the screen and on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and PPIC's Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please visit the PPIC website to find information on how you too can join PPIC as a sponsor or donor. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. We are indeed nonpartisan. At the end of today's program, there will be time to respond to audience's questions. For those of you here in Sacramento, please raise your hand and PPIC staff will come to you with a microphone. Please state your name and organization before asking your question. For those of you joining us virtually, please send an email to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Be sure to also include your name and organization along with your question. PPIC will be monitoring the questions that come in and incorporate them as much as we are able to do so. Lastly, if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phone. Now on to the program. I'm pleased to turn it over to Tani to moderate today's conversation.
Thank you, Chet, and we're so pleased to have our chair here, Chet, at this event at the Speaker Series. Let me also say welcome to all of you. I know we have, as a result of having such a high-ranking person here in California, we have a lot of folks from the Capitol. So welcome, we're happy to have you, and as you know later, we do a little Q&A in case you're interested. But we are very blessed and fortunate to have Assembly Speaker Rendon here today. He is, as you may know, the 70th Speaker of the Assembly of California. He is the 3rd longest serving Speaker and the longest serving Speaker in a time of term limits. And if any of you remember what it was like before term limits, when term limits came, there was such an incredible change and regular change in the Capitol. And Speaker Rendon has led throughout all of those transitions. We at PPIC are really fortunate to have had Speaker Rendon here several other times, but we are especially lucky to have him here now as the budget has closed and we are all here concerned about policy in California. Let me also say about Speaker Rendon that I've had the pleasure of his leadership when I was the chief, going to him and getting direction as he provided assistance and guidance for the third branch to seek justice. And as we'll get to later, truly, he is a person from community college to his doctorate, to postdoctoral work, and we have indeed been fortunate to have him lead California these years. Welcome, Mr. Speaker. You know that you will be Mr. Speaker for the rest of your life, so I will call you that throughout this interview. We'll start off with asking you, over all that you have seen and all of the policy issues and all that you have guided, what would you say is your proudest accomplishment or accomplishments as Speaker of the Assembly?
A very local issue. My work on the redevelopment of the Los Angeles River, the lower Los Angeles River in particular, more and more provincial, has been, I think, it's transformative, but also I think an analogy for the larger state. We seem to have incredible pockets of development and redevelopment throughout the state, and you see that in all over the state where there's uneven or unequal distribution of resources and those types of things. I've always told the story about flying into LAX my freshman year and seeing the redevelopment of the LA River and the Los Angeles side and the sort of green ribbon and all the cool stuff that's happening, that Guggenheim Ferris wheel and all the cool stuff that they're doing, and then the plane moves over into my district and there's nothing there. And that, for me, that's part of the California story. And to sort of to try to change that on a local level is incredibly important to me. And I think it's also sort of illustrative of a lot that we've done as a state in the time since my class got here in 2012, making sure that whether it was the water bond, the park bond, our transportation efforts, making sure the disadvantaged communities got as much share of the benefits as other parts of the state. So for me, it's the redevelopment of the lower Los Angeles River and all that means with the Cultural Arts Center and all of that. But I think if you use that as an analogy for the rest of the state and what we've done, I think I think that helps tell a fuller story.
I really enjoy how you use that as an analogy when you start with the lower part of the LA River and you look at that and you look at what it could be and who it serves. And then you look over at the shiny object and you look to really seek some parity and equity throughout the state. California is so large with so many different diverse requests and needs, making your job all the harder about distribution and ideas and priorities. California. What would you say is one of the top issues for California as we go forward?
Honestly, 5 years ago, I would have said something like housing and energy reliability. If we're not serious about the existential questions, if we're not serious now, we never will be. And when I mean existential questions, I mean the survival of the planet. I have a 4-year-old daughter. Will she live to be 25? I don't know. The way the planet is trending, I'm not sure. Will we have a democracy in this country in 2-3 years? I don't know. I think it's a question that's unanswered. Will California be part of a 50-state transcontinental country in 2 years? I don't know. I think there are very fundamental existential questions that I think are sort of at the back of our consciousness, and we kind of ignore sometimes, and we think they're important, and then Sunday comes and it's kickoff time, and like, yay, let's go look at that, or we got to do this thing. But I think we really have to focus on existential questions. I really think the future of the planet, climate change is, you look at the last UN study, we're worse off than we thought we were, significantly worse off than we thought we were. And as far as American democracy is concerned, I mean, we've seen the rise of fascist governments in Hungary, Austria, Brazil, very close in France. It could very easily and very quickly happen here.
Well, it reminds me that California, actually the United States is only 230 plus years old, and California of all the states leads. And as you point out, when you talk about the existential questions, did becoming a parent and have a family change how you thought about the infiniteness of our resources in our state and our world?
It slows you down, right? I mean, it's like anything else that's of value or meaning. It forces you into sort of a moment of like, I'm just going to sit here and do this, right? So I think it forced me to be more present, right? There's this, Buddhism, they talk about like a sense of immediacy, or, mountaineering in California. John Muir talks about the immediacy as well, right? That sense of like it's funny because you're talking about existential questions, but it's really about the moment, right? It's really about like where we are right now and how this fits into a larger whole to a large extent. So, I mean, it certainly forced me to be aware of individual moments and how those moments link to the greater whole, and how the greater whole is, dependent on so many factors that are larger than you. In our roles, the people in this room, you can, you have a modicum, you have an ability to influence things, but you can't do it alone. And I think, you drop your kid off at childcare every day, you hope she'll be okay. You turn her over to the care of a physician, you hope she'll be okay. There's a lot out there that is beyond your control. And I think, being a parent does make you think about the larger whole and the extent to which you can control some things, the extent to which you have a little bit of control over some things, and the extent to which it's like, oh, here we go, right? We're rolling the dice every day. So, yeah, I mean, it certainly changes your maybe not your views, but your consciousness.
Yeah, and the way you described it, it sounds like you're Speaker of the Assembly in California. You have macro issues, and many of them. And then you also have micro issues, in your personal life and in living, and yet those micro and macro, they meet on a road. And the way you've described that, I wonder as Speaker, when you look back and all that you learned on the job and all that happened that you made up because we had issues that had never happened before, what is the one thing you wish you had known then, starting out as Speaker, that you know now?
I don't know. I don't know that there were a lot of surprises. Well, yes and no, right? I mean, I think, I ran nonprofits, and you kind of wake up every day and you have a game plan, and then something happens, and you're like, whoa, right? I think, and those unknowns are things, that can be anything from a member not showing up when you have only the number of votes you need, or it can be a pandemic, or it can be Me Too, or it can be, Donald Trump. It can be, any of a wide range of things. So on a daily basis, you never know what you're going to be faced with. From a larger sort of like thematic standpoint, I was working in the nonprofit sector for 20 years, ran for office. I really loved being an assembly member the first 4 years, just running my bills and representing my community. And then I became Speaker, and about 2 or 3 days in the Speaker's office, I was like, oh crap, I'm back. Like, I'm doing administration again, right? There's like a lot of HR and that kind of stuff, and I'm signing stuff. Budgeting, internal budgeting, right? So yeah, I mean, there are those surprises where, the stories, every narrative tends to be a grand narrative, right? It's about like, oh, we did this, we did that, but nobody tells, I have retired CHP, who drive me around, and I'm always talking to them about different things. And I asked one day, I said, what's the best cop show? Like, what's the best show that best, like, depicts what it's like to be a cop? I don't remember which one it was, which one of my sergeants. He's like, it's too boring. He's like, it's usually filling out paperwork or sitting in court for something to happen, right? The speakership's a lot of that, right? It's a lot of like, I'm gonna listen to this briefing, and it's gonna last half an hour, and then the decision I'm going to make is going to last 4 seconds. Like, let's do that second thing. So it's an administrative position to a large extent, and I probably should have been aware of that, but I didn't think much about it. I got fooled. I got lulled in.
Well, the good part, it sounds like once you realized that, you were well equipped to take it, because as a nonprofit, as you pointed out, as a director, executive director, every day was a surprise.
Yep.
And it sounds like that might be the case. I know that I was one of the many people in your foyer trying to get through to your door to give you a briefing.
Right.
But
those were good. Didn't mind those.
That's good to know. That's
Right.
good to know. Speaking of the pandemic you brought up, is one of those things that, we might have thought of in a science fiction movie, and there were several out there that sort of spoke to this, but then it came, and all eyes were on California. You led. Tell me how you did it and what lessons, because we might have another one.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's the most sort of like, from a narrative perspective, I mean, just the sort of, atmospherics around it, right? We closed down the legislature, which in retrospect, and politicians are always told to like be certain about stuff. I don't know how I feel about it, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we did the right thing in shutting down the legislature, to be honest, and I think we're still paying the price to a large extent. But we shut down the legislature. Everybody went home. I thought it was very important, either symbolically or otherwise, that we were in the building. My chief, Carrie Cornwell's here. She and I went in. I remember talking to CHP outdoors. He said, that day, he said, every day there's like 2,000 people in here. Today there's like 4.
Mm-hmm.
And we went in every day. And, and it was from, I believe in democracy and democratic theory, and that's about legislatures, right? I mean, every form of government has an executive branch, but only democracies have a legislative branch. And I thought it was important to physically be there, even if nobody knew. Nobody really did know. So we'd go in there, and, we'd leave the doors open because it didn't matter, right? And we just kind of move around, and there's no restaurants, and we're eating, lunch from home. And, half of my life is spent avoiding lobbyists, except for Edison. And whoever else is here. But, it was cool. I remember like eating my lunch in the rotunda, right? I just take my sack lunch, and I'd put my my phone, the music on. It sounds great in the rotunda. I remember when I'm a member of the Ernest Hemingway Society, and I was listening to the podcast, that whatever it was that week, and I thought, that was cool. And I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm going to call up the guy who's the head of the Ernest Hemingway Society, teaches at Wayne State in Indiana. I'm like, I'm just going to call him up and talk to him, right? I called him up, and I'm like in the rotunda eating lunch, talking to this, Wayne State literature professor. It was just this sort of like, these moments of like freedom, right? When, the rules are, it just seems like you break from what you normally do, and you can do interesting things. So, from my perspective, it was kind of a moment of kind of like, of thinking about the workplace from a different perspective, and in an interesting way, but keeping in mind that like democracy and the legislature had to be represented during that moment. So it was different. When the lockdown started, my daughter was 6 months old, and to not go to events at night was fantastic, right? To not travel back and forth, right? Weekends from Friday night to Sunday night, it was Annie, the baby, and I, 3 of us. That was it. No events, no dinners. It was, that bonding amidst all that was happening on the outside, right? It was, I'm a big fan of art history, right? Dadaism was this moment when everybody would converge on Café Voltaire, which was in Zurich, right? And it's in the middle of, Switzerland, which is a neutral country, and the world was going to hell on the outside, right? And there's all these artists in this cafe, and they're doing just crazy shit, right? And it was this moment of like pure freedom amidst hell, right?
Yeah.
And for me, it was always that sort of like, this is a terrible thing, but like, let's play with it and let's see what we can do with it.
The way you described that, it does sound freeing. And I have a hard time picturing you in the rotunda eating lunch, playing a podcast, because just of what we know about the Capitol and how if any of us saw you there, we'd swarm you because we'd just try to get a word in edgewise. So it sounds like it freed you in many ways to think about things differently. At the same time, at the same time allowing you to bond and to have another aspect of your life that no one expected to have, actually.
Yeah.
And then now, as you said, one of the lessons is we're all still paying for it.
Yeah.
And we've all learned from it to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah, I find that I like also, frankly, your references to philosophy and to literature. And it's a big part of your life. Did that have a lot to do with how you led and how you taught others and brought others along and how you led in your caucus?
I don't think so. There's, like all of us, there's different parts of us. I don't feel like I read specifically to deal with the workplace or about leadership. I read for, other reasons. I'm interested in the human condition and that kind of thing. So I don't think, maybe it seeps in, right? Maybe it seeps in and ideas about creativity and approaching things differently and theories of play, which I'm really interested in, and some psychological theories that I'm interested in. But that's not, I don't read and think like, what does this have to do with the workplace or leadership? I just kind of read and think about the human condition and what it means to be human. And, Carlos Castaneda or Jose Mariátegui, I can't remember, said, think about death every 10 seconds. And, which I don't do. I think about it every 3 seconds. And just this sense of like, how do you this is all going to end. And you kind of wake up and you're like, there's the clock's ticking. How do you get done the things you want to get done and find meaning from your life, and particularly when you're up against a clock that's ticking. That's kind of what I read for.
Yeah, and I think about that, and especially as you sit atop a lot of the democracy, a lot of the conversation, and as you had mentioned earlier, trying to keep track and stay on track and focus and not the next shiny object, but trying to stay focused and solve some of the bigger things. It sounds like it might even be a place of refuge amidst all of, I want to say that, one of my colleagues always says, at least about the judiciary, there's too much democracy here. And really he's referring to the fact that we talk too much. And I don't know that that's in your branch.
Politicians never talk too much. Very succinct. Except for the ones who are here. None of them are here.
So you've presided for a lot of change and diversity in California. And we're in 2023 in a place where we've seen increased diversity in across the board, record numbers of women, Latinos, legislators identifying as LGBTQ+. And I'd ask you, how has that made a difference? What does it do to policy from your perspective?
Yeah, you talked about being a father. Part of that is being really anal, and I've seen this piece of trash on the floor, and I need to clean it up, or otherwise I'll be distracted by it the whole time. When Jerry Brown left, the gift he gave me was a book called American Genocide, about all the atrocities, mostly against Northern California tribes, north of Sacramento and into Southern Oregon. And, was it during COVID that I read it? Maybe. Because I remember reading it, I like going in the back of the chambers when we're out of session and reading. It's quiet, and I like the sounds, it echoes. And I remember reading it and thinking, like, a lot of the decisions that were made were at these desks that led to genocide. It's very easy to think about history as abstract, or it's thousands of miles away, it's in Europe, it's in Asia, it's all over the place. And I'm sitting there and I'm at the desks where people pushed buttons. I don't know if they pushed buttons back then, but I'm at the desk where people made decisions that led to the destruction of civilizations and the end of lives. And and you can say the same thing with Chinese Exclusionary Act. You can say the same thing, with whatever, long 170-some-year history, a lot of bad things, a lot of really bad decisions have been made at those desks in World War II, with the Japanese Americans. And I think, what diversity does is it brings new people to those desks and new perspectives to those desks. And the people pushing those buttons have been through very different experiences. And sort of like, and it's not only those people, but psychically, right? Psychically, it's what their parents, what their grandparents went through, right? And it's also the sort of like, I've told this story before, but my wife is Asian American, and she, wanted her nephew to see, God, I can't remember the name of the TV show with the Asian American family, and she wanted him to see the show, and he's like 8, he's not interested, right? He's like on Nintendo or whatever they're doing, and then so she kind of gave up, and we're all doing our own thing, and then all of a sudden he screams at the TV. He says, "That kid looks like me." And that moment of like, that recognition is a really big deal. And I think for me, you look up in the gallery and you see school children there, and, for them to see a Lori Wilson, for them to see a Sabrina Cervantes, for them to see a James Ramos, and to say, she looks like me, he looks like me, is all of a sudden, it's this embodied experience, right? You think like, they start to think about themselves differently. And that's, we know, whether it's generational trauma or individual trauma, we know that imagination is so important to that, right? Being able to, that's why role playing is so important in psychology and, all that kind of stuff, right? You have to be able to imagine yourself having those conversations. You have to imagine yourself sitting in those seats. So that's why it's important. That's a long answer. I'm now really self-conscious because I made fun of politicians talking too long. I'm gonna answer yes or no to all your questions from now on. I'm gonna be like a moody junior high school kid. Oh.
No. When I was saying talk too much, by otherwise too much democracy, I also meant not listening to each other, therefore repetitive conversation. So no, I'm not referring to that.
Yeah, I know.
I do enjoy how you took us back to the idea that this state has grown, it's had a lot of issues, and we haven't always been our best, and that's across the branches and decisions made, and there is a rectification, and that now the people sitting in those seats who find themselves in a place to cast a vote are really, again, part of the history of redemption in some ways, but also symbolically to see each other, because when you see someone, your imagination starts to wonder, well, what was their life like and what did they overcome? And California is so rich with that. Yeah,
it is. And to your point, I mean, this is another quote I've talked about before, but Catcher in the Rye, right? Holden Caulfield, he says, when I close my eyes, I can punch a guy in the face, but when I open my eyes, I can't. And that's a big part of politics too, right? I mean, it's easy to vilify Republicans. It's maybe not easy. But you can vilify somebody who belongs to a different party than you. You can vilify somebody from a different part of the state. You can vilify somebody who has different views than you. But if you actually know them, if you actually open your eyes, it's harder to punch them.
Exactly. I think you make a good point of how the legislature works together. The legislature works together. We are the picture of democracy when you look across the state and where it's working and where it isn't. So speaking of that working together, I'd like to turn to the budget. I was just talking with Chet. Chet gave some remarks about we can all exhale now. The budget's been signed, and now here we are going forward. And you were in the room when it happened, quoting the Hamilton song. So I'd like to ask you about this year's budget package. What would you like to share about it? The process, the choices, opportunities missed, all of the above.
Oh, how's that?
Very teenager.
Yeah, like that? Yeah.
Very good.
So, it was a lot of things. I mean, the what we did particularly on childcare is obviously, close to home, and it's, I like narratives, I like stories, right? I ran for office because because of cuts to early childhood education, I'd still be running a nonprofit making a nice pension, by the way, if it hadn't been for cuts in early childhood education. And I ended up here. And to put, increase provider rates by 25%. It's cool. It's everything. For me, it's everything. And it's, it's easy to think about the kids. It's easy to think about, the curriculum and all they're going to experience in bonding and all that stuff in the childcare, but to think about the parents too, right? And the ancillary benefits of, parenting classes and all those things. And just the peace of mind of dropping off your kid in a safe place. And learning place, and then knowing you can go to work it's everything. And that goes back to COVID, right? I mean, my wife works from home. When COVID happened, she's 6 months old. What do we do, right? And that's us. We have a lot of benefits that other people don't. So, for me, ultimately, that was the biggest thing. The most important thing, but our funding, from the time I got here until now, we've gone, depending on, there's a lot of ways to look at math, right? But we were 48th, 49th in the country in per pupil spending education. We're in the top 9 or 10 now. So I mean, up and down, the budget is a good budget, but it's temporary. It is. I mean, we look at the stock market every day. I'm worried about the future, and I think, the extent to which we were able to maintain programs and services, particularly to the most vulnerable Californians, is great. But I'm very worried about next year's budget and the year after that.
Mm-hmm. That it's evident in all of the comments made that there was really this effort to keep progress going, but also with a wary eye for the future. And you've done a lot with early childhood education for many years. You indicated that was your impetus, right, for leaving the pension building job of a nonprofit and coming to public service.
Absolutely, yeah. I was, I've been in office 10 years. I feel like I've told my stories a billion times, but my staff always tells me there's one person in the audience who hasn't heard it before, so I'm talking to that one person. Everybody else, you can just tune out and go on your phones. But, I was running a nonprofit. I was upstairs and working, doing a gang, first-time offender at-risk youth gang program. And downstairs was a child care center, and I just kind of ignored it, because I was running upstairs every day and doing GED classes and, tattoo removals and all that stuff. And then, you start to realize that the kids, the families, the communities that have the greatest access to early childhood education don't end up upstairs. They don't end up in my gang programs, in first-time offender programs, at-risk youth programs. It was so unbelievably clear. So, for me, that was, to a large extent, what we did in the nonprofit sector was, saving lives and ambulance services and putting Band-Aids on things. But that's a real way of stopping the cycle of poverty. It's in communities and families. That's very real.
Mm-hmm. It's fortuitous that you were upstairs above that childhood development center, and also, as you point out earlier in your earlier answer, that getting money like that into the budget helps generations and helps families and eases it all the way around in terms of the need as they grow, and also provides exactly what you said, the safety that we want to drop our kids off and know they're safe.
Yeah, can I tell a story real quick?
Please.
Hector Della Torre is my appointee to the California Air Resources Board. He was talking about his daughters, they both go to private schools, I can't remember where, or maybe they graduated. And he was talking about, he said, every month I'd write a check for them, for their tuition. And he said, I don't like writing checks. Who does, right? But he said, it was publicly funded, scholarships and fellowships that allowed me to get in a position where now I can do this, right? And that's part of it. That's part of the whole cycle. So yeah, I mean, for me, the families that I started out helping, 20, 25 years ago, I'm inclined to think the vast, vast, vast majority of them are not on subsidized childcare anymore. I'm inclined to think they're, and that's what we do. That's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to your answer about how You started with the lower LA River, right?
Yep.
It's local. I wanted to talk to you about something that seems to be in the papers every day for good reason, and that's the housing, homelessness, unhoused issue. And I know that the legislature in recent years has really worked on a lot of policy and done quite a bit for California to improve policies to make housing either more plentiful and affordable. And can you talk a little bit about those policies, if you believe they've made a difference, what we need to do more, and any connection you see to that with the unhoused population?
I think it's too soon. I mean, those problems, again, politics and politicians, like, we do press conferences and act like we've solved things, but these are problems that take generations to create and will take a long time to resolve. We haven't fixed the homeless crisis. You walk outside, we haven't fixed the homeless crisis. We haven't fixed the housing crisis. We may not fix it in the next 3 to 5 years, but we need to stay on it. James Gallagher and I met at the beginning of the year. The first thing on his agenda, the first thing on my agenda was, like, we've given all these cities and counties a whole heck of a lot of money for housing and homelessness. We've given them a lot of tools for dealing with housing and homelessness. Let's talk about accountability now, right? Let's talk about benchmarks. Let's see your data. Where are you? So yeah, I mean, we're starting to address the crisis in a real and serious way. We've started to address it in a real and serious way. Anybody who tells you we've made progress is lying. I mean, it's going to take a while.
Do you think that when you look at all the policies and the efforts, and it will take time and years, and we're learning more and more about the issue, is it better handled at the state level or municipal level?
I think it's both. I mean, I think and this is very controversial. I got to go home. I got to go home to my district and meet my council members, and they're always like, what'd you do? I think we need to provide carrots. That's cool. Funding, that type of thing. But we need to provide sticks too, because not everybody's a good actor. Or some people don't have our sense of immediacy. So I think it requires both.
I'm going to switch to gun violence. And PPIC recently did a survey research study, and I was surprised to hear that talking about mass shootings, which have been defined as 4 or more people injured or killed, that so far in 2023, 6 months in, California on average has had a mass shooting every 6 days. I think that's what it is. Every 6 days. So the question is, what do we do about that?
Well, I'm proud of the gun laws that we, as a state, both during my time here, that we passed. I think 4 years ago, we passed 5 of the strictest gun laws in the country. I don't know that Jerry Brown signed all of them. I think he vetoed 2 or 3. But our numbers, those numbers are bad, not what we want them to be, but better than most states. Earlier we were talking about Dadaism. I always, when I think of gun violence, there's a line Andre Breton wrote, "The Manifesto of Surrealism," and sort of like one of the opening lines, he says, the purest act of surrealism is to fire a pistol into a crowd. Right? And if you think about, he was talking about madness, right? He was talking about nightmares. He was talking about, what it means to be absurd. And that's not absurd. I mean, that's every day. It really is, or once out of every 6 days in California and every day in the United States. And I think the extent to which, the extent to which we're accepting of that, or explain it away as sort of a political issue rather than a moral issue, is it's grotesque, and it's a sign of a societal illness. In the same way that denying that I'm sitting here would be a sign of an individual mental illness, right? Mm-hmm. It's to not do something about it is grotesque, and we don't. And it's funny, you hear, you go to gun rallies and stuff, and people say, like, oh, Congress is going to finally do something. They're not. I don't believe they are. They're not. We have to in California, and we have. And I'm not, I have 2 years here left. I'm not waiting for anybody in D.C. to do anything. I don't have any faith that they will. They're not going to. We're on our own, and that's unfortunate, but we'll do it.
Well, as you say, California's done quite a bit in this area, and we do, as you also reference, have the strongest gun enforcement laws. And as you also pointed out, it's true, while we may have certain ratings on our gun violence, we're still lower than the rest of the nation. But there's still a lot of work being done, and I know that the legislature partners with the Department of Justice and also pursuing solutions to those kinds of things. I'm told I have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to ask you about climate, because I know that also that was an early start for you and an incentive to get into policy work. So California has set ambitious goals in reducing carbon emissions, goals by years, and this is, as you've known, a means of addressing climate change for the better in California. So 2 questions. What are the keys to actually reaching those targets, and how well prepared are we to actually reach those targets, which are coming up on us pretty soon?
I think we have to explain, a kind of a sub-narrative of this half hour that we spent together has been about thinking locally, right? And I think, when Eddie Garcia he was working on SB 32, there was a strategy to it. He'd go to people's districts. He didn't meet with them in Sacramento. He went to people's districts and talked to them about it. My district, it's a heat island effect, right? Extreme heat, other part, So, I think you need to think about it on a local level, make it very tangible for people, to talk about the impact that it has on them, on their families. We've seen with older Americans, older folks, the impact that climate has, extreme heat, and all the attendant consequences. So I think we need to do a better job of framing it that way. In California, I was very critical a couple of years ago when I was in Scotland. I did a radio interview where I said, California can't keep talking about us being ahead of the curve on climate. We're behind. We're behind a lot of different places, but we're catching up. We had a good year that year. So I think we're better prepared than a lot of places now, but we need to do better, and we need to be more aggressive, and we need to tackle it more quickly.
And we do lead, and we do raise awareness, and all of these are the same efforts, and nothing happens without effort. So I only have a few more minutes before I go to the audience, but I wanted to just ask, I've mentioned earlier your personal background, primarily educational, but I know that you are the child of working class parents, and the grandson of immigrants. And you went from, we share a community college, and then you went on to get your PhD. And so I wondered, how has that shaped your leadership, your life?
Did you go to Sacramento City?
I did.
Oh, cool. Because I know you went to McClatchy, like everybody else who's incredibly successful. That's really cool. What was your question? I got distracted.
You did.
I didn't know you went to community college. That's awesome.
It was, how did your background shape you? Who you are today, how you've led?
Oh, yeah. You're asking, I have 3 sisters. It's kind of like a little bit of like the Brady Bunch, right? I had an older sister who was overachieving, and I was always like, something to strive and also resent. They'd take the roll in class, and they'd read my name, and they'd say, oh, you're Elizabeth's brother. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not her. I'm not going to get an A. And then my parents were like, my dad, I always said, I have a Old Testament mother and a New Testament dad. My mom was like fire and brimstone, and I flunked out of school. My mom's like, you're gonna go to hell. It's the end of the world, and then my dad's like, I remember my dad looking at my report card. He's like, F, 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 F. He's like, oh, D-, okay. You're capable of learning something, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of always made me feel there's this sense of like, you're going to be loved and accepted, but there's consequences too, right? I mean, you can't, it wasn't a group hug, right? So that sense of, different types of love and all of that, and then being part of a family. I mean, we still, every Monday night, we still have dinner. This job got in the way. Now it's every fall, Monday night during the fall, we still have dinner. That's everything. It's, that's all that, earlier I was talking about, why I read philosophy. It's about, what it means, the human condition, or what it means to be human. And that's everything. There's nothing else.
I think you said it all with the human condition. It's love, but consequences.
Yeah, for sure.
I have other questions, but I know that the audience gets an opportunity to ask you questions also. And so we have runners in the back who are going to come up to you if you raise your hand to ask the speaker a question. And so I see hands up, but I'm looking for whoever has a mic to wave to me. I see hand up over here in the center on the table here. Yes. Thank you, Sal. Perfect.
We're going to try this. Still, Speaker Rendon, what would you offer as advice to the next speaker for California?
Advice. Wake up every day, have a game plan. It'll change. You won't get through, if you have a list of 10 things, you won't get through number 5 because everything will go to hell. But at the end of the day, go back to that list and go back to that game plan and tackle it tomorrow. I think so often we, in this job in particular, at the beginning of the year, it's like, hey, we're going to do all these things, and then things come up and you never go back. And I think you have to kind of remain focused on your objectives and not let the things that happen are going to change your timelines and all of that, but they can't, they can't get in the way of doing what you really want to get done.
Thank you. And I'm remiss. Also, if you could state your name before you ask the question, and I see Anne is sitting next to someone.
My name is Suresh. My question is, given CDCR is the literal backbone infrastructure of public safety in the state of California, and that decades of data show that the billions of dollars that CDCR receives is almost guaranteed to fund racism, sexism, and violent behavior, what would be different about the $18 billion CDCR receives this year?
Well, I think, I'm very interested in comparative models. I think we so narrowly, and particularly within the context of California, which is a country of a republic of 40 million people, I think to compare ourselves to South Carolina is silly for a lot of reasons. And I think when it comes to criminal justice, the comparative models I'm more interested in are places in Scandinavia, like Norway, where I think some of our members are going soon to take a trip. The architect, Frank Gehry, who I'm working on the LA River with, did a design for a prison for a correctional facility. I think the state of Connecticut asked him to do a mock-up. But I mean, I think we need to dramatically rethink our corrections in this state and in this country, and I'll say in this state and this country because I think some of the rest of the world has got it right.
Thank you. Yancy, you have a person, your hand raised?
Hi, my name is Brianna Pietri. I have a question about homelessness, specifically that you mentioned it would take 3 to 5 years for homelessness to be taken or tackled down even more. But why is it taking so long, 3 to 5 years? And besides the resources for mental health, what other core or what other services should be created for people who are homeless or at risk of being homeless?
Yeah, I think part of the crisis is we just don't have enough housing stock. I mean, we need to have more units. Like, we're getting the data, but we need to have millions of more units online just to bring down the price of housing so that it's affordable for working families. Part of my job, I'm on the UC Board of Regents and the Cal State Board of Trustees. The housing vulnerable population and the sort of couch surfing that goes on in the Cal States and the UCs and the community college is mind-boggling. The economy, with any sort of fluctuations in the economy, you're going to see another 10, 15, 20% more people who are going to lose their homes. So, I mean, unless we have more housing stock, we're not going to solve the homeless crisis because we're simply going to have more homeless people. In terms of programs and services, I think a lot of our homeless crisis, a lot of our mental health crisis, quite frankly, is the result of fighting two wars in this country, one after the other, and there was some overlap, right? There are consequences for what happens somewhere else, right? We tend to think of these things as abstract and far away. It's like if you read about the history of psychology, right? I mean, there's no surprise why it happened. The big boom happened right after World War I, right? Where we're dealing with a lot of the crises of people living in foxholes and being eaten by rats and having to sit near dead bodies for extended periods of time. I mean, what we've done on a global level as a country has real consequences, and then our lack of treating veterans with dignity once they get back has further consequences as well.
Thank you. We have a question online. We have about a couple hundred people online watching. Stephen?
Thank you. This question comes from Joseph Viella with the California Wellness Foundation. And he wants to know if you could reflect a bit on something you think you could do better in your role as a leader.
Oh, God, everything. It always weirds me out when people say I don't have any regrets. It's like I have 80 every minute. Something I could do better. We talked about Old Testament and New Testament. I put up with a lot of shit, like any manager. We can be overly forgiving at times, and you want to think of, I'm talking to you, but I know the person's in the computer. I removed some chairs from people and those types of things, but there's a lot of game playing in politics, and there's a lot of game playing in the world. I get it. I was in academia. There's game playing there. There's game playing in the nonprofit sector. But I think to a large extent, I always wanted to kind of be forgiving and kind of provide people with opportunities for redemption. And, I don't always know that I was as quick to punish as I should have. It's a pretty honest answer, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was very. Cool. Thank you. Thank you for your
staff
candor.
Probably doesn't like that answer. I should have sent more birthday cards. What's that?
We're going to ask, Sal has a person.
From Cal Matters, I'm Lynn. You mentioned in a previous interview that you were planning to run for state treasurer in 2026. What about that role in the government interests you, and what do you hope to accomplish in that role?
Career questions are so dull. State treasurers, I talked a lot about the fiscal crisis that led me here. I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done as a state. We have our rainy day fund is larger than than the budgets of 30-some states. That has real consequences for people. For me, being in that role is an opportunity to continue to work on the state's fiscal future, and as unsexy as that sounds sometimes, the fiscal, the fiscal future of the state has direct impacts on the programs and services that we all want to see as a state.
Thank you. Yancy?
Hi, Mr. Speaker. My name is Ethan, and I was wondering what role do you believe nuclear energy plays in our fight against climate change, and what do you think the future of the Diablo Canyon power plant is?
Nuclear energy has become this fascinating sort of like generational issue, right? And, you know, feels like young people and Europeans have a different view than people my age and all of that. I mean, if we can figure out some of the problems with disposal and all that stuff of nuclear waste, then I think it's a clean and effective supplier of energy. I'd be in favor of it. I still have tremendous concerns and obviously safety concerns as well. I do think to an extent, from the standpoint of like real politics, not just sort of, you know, drafting public policy on a piece of paper, but from the standpoint of real politics, I do think there's still a perception issue that makes it very difficult in this culture, in this country, to do. Very different in other countries. Although it's kind of weird, like in other, you know, like Germany or Austria was, you know, up until recently had like most of their power from nuclear energy, but it wasn't in the country, right? It was like Austrian power in Germany, right? So, you know, it's interesting from that perspective. So if your question is what is the future, I don't think there's a bright future because I think the perception makes it difficult.
Thank you. Anne?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was very concerned by your pessimism about whether or not in 3 years we would remain a democratic country. My feeling is that this nation the people have paid a great deal to be democratic. Are you expressing doubt about the people or it's the leadership? And secondly, does our growth in diversity becomes a threat or a facilitation to democracy?
I think our diversity helps to facilitate democracy. I think there is a huge chunk of our population that's not currently committed to democracy or democratic institutions. I think the way information is shared, I think the way information is disseminated makes that incredibly difficult. I also think the extent to which, I remember Holly Mitchell, when she was in the legislature, I remember her talking to one of our colleagues, and she said, we just read different newspapers. And the extent to which there's not a sort of common, even a common body of knowledge anymore that's accepted by everybody is petrifying to me. You saw that around COVID all the time. I had, like, during COVID, I would have 20 different people telling me what the right thing to do was. That makes me scared, and it makes me scared for democracy, the future of democracy.
Thank you. Last question, Jans.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. My name is Matt Einey, and I have a question around transit. Of course, Governor Newsom signed into law just recently the current budget bill into law, and that gave a parachute for transit agencies across the state. But even then, there's still long-standing concerns about operational funding as well as just, you know, the existing capital funds, which are trying to be reallocated towards operations for many agencies. And so I just wanted to ask you, what do you think right now is the current state in the Assembly for taking up questions or potential bills around longer-term funding solutions for our transit operations?
I'm very committed to transit. I think a lot of my colleagues are very committed to transit. I think for the state, this again gets into the jurisdictional issues, right? Local versus state. I think for the state to commit their resources to operations that's dangerous. I think it's very dangerous from a long-term perspective. I think local transit in LA has done this. You know, I think local entities, local communities need to tax themselves to pay for their own transit projects. No problem paying for individual projects and construction and that kind of stuff. That's cool. That's one time. But to do it on an ongoing basis is like, I get the desire to do it, particularly during times of fiscal crisis, emergencies. But you know, to start, you know, to start choosing different agencies to fund is, I think it's dangerous, and I think it starts to get us off the fiscal cliff, and having to choose between different entities is hard.
Mr. Speaker, we're so grateful for your thoughts today. They were deep and they were candid. And it resonates with all of us, what you say. PPIC, we strive for facts with our nonpartisan approach, but you enlightened us all today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our sponsors who make this possible. Thank you to our chair, Chet Hewitt, for the introduction. Thank you all, but especially to you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you again.
Thanks. Thank you.